This is Change Your Mindset Podcast, the podcast that helps change your life by helping change the mindset of the 99% into the 1% mindset. Here's your host, Adrian Gomez.
Welcome back to another podcast episode of Change Your Mindset. As always, I'm your host, Adrian Gomez. Approximately 1 year ago, July 11th, I created my first podcast episode. So I've been doing this for a year now, and obviously it's been a journey. My goal when I started this podcast was changing the mindset of 99%, which is pretty much the majority of the population, into the 1%, which would be how wealthy people think and people that are successful. That's why I started this podcast, to hopefully change people's mindsets and hopefully change their lives. Because at the end of the day, I see how society is and how messed up it is and all this negativity and how downward our society is going and the struggles that people go through and they see in daily life, and you see it pretty much everywhere. And it's unfortunate. And instead of complaining and whining like majority of people do, I wanted to do something about it. So I did. I created this podcast, and I knew from the beginning it wasn't going to be easy, because I know anything you start in life at the bottom, it's never easy. It takes time to grow and gain traction, and I knew that from the beginning. It's not going to be easy. Nothing in life is easy when you start it. It's a journey. Obviously, when I started the podcast, not many people listen, or pretty much not any. Until this day, I have approximately a little bit above 200 people per month that listen to these podcast episodes. And I appreciate you for listening to these podcast episodes. And I do realize some podcast episodes get 200 downloads or listens per episode, per day. I understand that. And I know I could have created a podcast that I talked about entertainment, celebrities, sports, musician, maybe some comedy, anything that everyone else does that gains traction and gains popularity, because some people, that's all they care about. They just want to be entertained. There's a lot of listeners you will get for doing that. And I realized if I do a podcast, well, changing your mindset, actually trying to educate people and what's really going on and how to change your way of thinking, I knew it wouldn't get a lot of listens. And I was okay with that. Because to some people, changing someone's mindset to change their life is more meaningful than thousands and thousands of listeners that have the same life and think the same way as everyone else. Because at the end of the day, they're just going to be, as I say, the 99% of people. So changing one person's mindset from the 99 to 1% actually means something. And it's not about the money, because I know some people do certain things for money. Obviously, if it's a podcast or trying to promote something, the end game is money. I actually lose money doing this podcast. When I started Podbean, which is the platform I use where they can send out my podcast episodes to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever it is, they do all that work for me. And I pay them $348 for a yearly subscription. So I already started off $348 down the drain starting this podcast. Creating this microphone I had, it's a Shure MV7. Costs approximately around $200. I'm already down $500. And plus the stand costs around $25. And that's not including the subscriptions I have to pay monthly for editing, clipping, and other subscriptions I have for this podcast to keep it going. And if it was about the money for me, I would have quit a long time ago. Because like I said, I'm losing money doing this podcast. For some people, it's about the money. For me, obviously, it's not. It's about getting the word out. The only revenue I get that actually helps combat these expenses is from Patron members. And obviously I have one Patron member, and that's from Blade262, which does help cut the expenses a little bit. So I really don't get much. So like I said, it's not really about the money. And I thank you if you are a Patreon member, and thank you Patreon member Blade262. And I know this podcast is going to take a while to grow. And I realize that if this podcast doesn't grow, that's my fault. If this podcast fails, that is my fault. If this podcast doesn't get more listeners, that's my fault. Because that means I failed you. Because my responsibility is to you. Listen to this podcast to provide the best information and hopefully change your mindset, and to keep you aware on what's really going on in this world, because nowadays you really don't hear the truth anymore. But like I said, if this podcast isn't successful, that's on me. But if people are getting useful information through this podcast and changing their mindset and hopefully affecting and changing their lives, I will obviously keep grinding with this podcast no matter what. That's a promise. When I first started doing episodes, I would do one episode per week. And for people that have been listening to this podcast for a while, I'm sure you realize within the last probably month or two, I've been doing 2 episodes per week. Like I said, my obligation is to you, and that's why I'm going to keep grinding. That's why I'm creating 2 episodes per week instead of back then when I would just do 1 per week. And like I said, I'm just going to keep grinding. And I hope if you're listening to these podcasts, wherever you go at or where you're trying to be in life, you grind as well. You keep going as well. Don't listen to these podcasts just to listen or just to support. Use these podcast episodes to impact your personal life, to grow, to be the best version of yourself. That's why I do these podcasts. Not just for people to listen, but for people to actually take action and change their lives. And it's going to take time. And like at this podcast, I started a year ago. I only have, like I said, around 200 listeners per month. It's going to take time. Like I said, I realized that when I started this podcast. And wherever you're going in life, if you're trying to be successful, wealthy, whatever it is, it's going to take time. But over time, it's going to grow. And another year from now, in July 2024, we're going to see where we're at. If we plateaued, then I failed you. If we lose listeners, then I failed you as well. But if we do grow, and this podcast grows, then that's to tell you something. Hard work pays off. Being disciplined, being consistent. Those 2 will get you anywhere you want in life. It's going to take 1 day at a time, 1 week at a time, 1 month at a time, 1 year at a time. But you have to start somewhere to get where you want to be. Is it going to be someday or day 1? Choice is yours. Doing these podcasts, there's no hidden agenda, no sinister agenda that some people have doing or starting businesses, whatever it is, podcasts, anything there is. There's nothing like that here. I didn't start this podcast to be famous, to go viral, for people to recognize me and know me. I don't honestly care about any of that. That's not me as a person. I could care less about any of that. But I know some people that are influencers want the glorification, want to be recognized, want to be seen by other people. By all means, that's them, but that's not me. I'm fine people not knowing who I am ever. They walk by me down the street and they listen to this podcast and don't even know who I am and don't recognize me. I'm totally fine with that. What matters to me is that these podcasts actually affects people's lives and actually mean something to people. When I did this podcast, everything I learned is from my father. So anything that I probably would want to be left behind would be his obviously legacy, his hard work, his discipline. Everything I talk about, I learned from him, obviously. And obviously I am who I am because of him. And if I didn't know what I know and what he didn't teach me, this podcast would not exist. changing people's mindsets and lives would not exist. So because of him, that's why I do what I do and why I created a podcast to implement hard work, discipline, consistency, and just not thinking like everybody else. Because when you think like everybody else, you end up like everybody else. And he doesn't even know that I do this podcast. He has no idea. I never talked to him about it. He has completely, utterly no idea. And I hope one day that I will be able to do a podcast with him in the future. And obviously, by then, he will know that I've been doing this podcast, and we'll see what he thinks about it. When I did this podcast, as of now, probably with me for a while, I didn't tell any friends or family. Until this day, they don't know I have a podcast as well. And the reason for that is I don't want friends and family supporting this podcast just because it's me. Because they want to support their nephew, their friend, their cousin, just because it's me. That's not what I want. I don't want people supporting this podcast just because they know me. I want people supporting this podcast that actually affects and implements and changes people's mindsets and affecting people's lives who don't even know me, who never even met me. To me, that's more important because that actually means that what I say actually means something. People aren't supporting it just because they know me or know who I am. They actually support me because what I say actually means something. Actually, they take value out of it. To me, that means more than someone supporting this podcast because they know who I am. Will I eventually tell friends and family? As of now, probably not. In the future, who knows? You can't predict the future. But as of now, people that support this podcast, it's people I don't even know. And as of now, I like to keep it that way. Because at the end of the day, I don't know who you are. I don't know who listens to this podcast. But I hope this podcast actually changes your mindset and changes your life. Because at the end of the day, that is my goal. But what I do know, that you will actually change your life. You will change your mindset. You will be successful. And the reason I say that is because you're listening to this podcast. You found this podcast for a reason. Whether you looked up change your mindset or anything, and this podcast came up or somebody shared it with you, you will change your mindset and you will be successful. Because you're listening to this podcast for a reason, because you want to change in your life. You're tired of the same life. You're tired of doing the same things. You're tired of being a slave to society. You're tired of being a slave to your job. And you will change your mindset and be the best version of yourself. There is no doubt in my mind that you will. At the end of the day, I'm always going to tell you the truth. No reason for me to lie to you. No reason for me to manipulate you. I'm going to say it how it is. Whether people want to hear it or not, some people need to hear certain things, because too many people nowadays think with their emotions and act on their emotions instead with logic. I'm always going to be truthful no matter what, whether people get triggered or don't like it. There's a reason I'm saying it. I'm not saying it to piss people off, get people mad. It's to benefit your life, to change your life, to change the way you're programmed to think. I'm always going to tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. Because nowadays, people are afraid to say the truth or to speak up, which is unfortunate, but that's how it is nowadays. Some of us are willing to say things that are true and that are right morally. And some of us will keep fighting the good fight. I heard this quote: if they stand in front of you, destroy them. If they stand next to you, respect them. If they stand behind you, protect them. At the end of the day, I'm going to do what's right and what's in the best interest for you listening, because that is my responsibility when I make these podcast episodes. My promise to you is I'm going to keep grinding, I'm going to keep going, I'm going to keep trying to provide the best information for you to change your mindset, to change your life as I can. It's a grind putting work into these podcasts, but at the end of the day, if it does benefit people, that's all that matters. If I'm putting in the work, you better be putting in the work as well. So that's going to be it for this podcast, guys. I appreciate you listening. As always, it's 1 year down doing this podcast. More to go. Like I said, it's a journey. You got to start somewhere. Whatever you're doing in life, you're going to start from the bottom. And you have to keep working, climbing that hill. It's not going to be easy. Doing this podcast, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. It takes time, takes dedication, takes consistency. But you got to work. And that's anything in life. Because hard work always pays off no matter what. As always, please subscribe, share with other people if we can help this podcast grow. I'm going to keep doing my part to help it grow as well. Thank you, Patron member Blade262. Like I said earlier, that's the only revenue I have coming into this podcast, and it does help with some of the expenses. And if you want to be a Patron member, the link will be in the description below. It does help support the podcast. And if you do become a member, I appreciate you as well. So thank you guys. As always, I wish you the best. Keep fighting the good fight. And as always, change your mindset to change your life. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Change Your Mindset podcast. Be sure to tune in every week for a new episode. As always, change your mindset to change your life.